What's up, everybody? My name is Matthew. I am an adjunct professor of evangelism at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a piece of a free lecture from my class on evangelism. Now, if you were an enrolled student at RPTS, this is just a sample of one of the things that you would get in class. Now, you may think of seminary as being that high ivory academic tower in which people translate Augustine from the Greek into the Latin and things like that. And we can teach you to do all those things too. But a lot of people don't know that seminary is very, very practical. At least this seminary, RPTS, is a very, very practical seminary. Our motto is trained under pastors or study under pastors, because what we really want to do is prepare people for the ministry of the proclamation of Christ, especially in the context of the local church, not exclusively the local church, but of course we love the local church and want to support it in every way we possibly can. We are a Reformed Presbyterian seminary, one of the oldest, in fact, the oldest conservative seminary in the United States of America, 1810 as our founding. The only others that are older than us would be Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, but they've all gone liberal by this point. So RPTS is the oldest conservative seminary. Now, what I want to do in this video is just take you into a piece of the classroom. This video is designed just to give you an opportunity to hear what it might be like in class. Okay, so we're not going to be parsing Greek verbs today. But what we are going to be doing is talking about evangelism. We're going to be talking about ways that we can convey the gospel of Christ to the nations. And in this particular lecture, what we're picking up on is a concept in evangelism called open air evangelism. It's something that the church has primarily lost, but is nevertheless a strong historical function of Reformed preaching. Okay, so let me take you into the classroom setting here, and I'll give you a piece of the lecture that I just delivered live in class to my students just yesterday. All right, so we're talking about open air evangelism today. That's our topic. And let's just start off here in the middle of the course content. You're jumping in with us, but this course has a lot more content. We've already covered basics on what the gospel is and why we proclaim it, the Great Commission, etc. here. So we're just talking about a nuanced piece of evangelism here. But we're starting off with the person of Hudson Taylor. Now, Hudson Taylor, 1832 to 1905, he is best known as an international Christian missionary evangelist. In fact, Hudson Taylor is the one who is largely credited with the evangelization of China. Now, there's a lot of work left to be done in the nation of China, no question about that. But he was one of the tips of the spear, so to speak, as far as bringing the gospel to China. 54 years serving in that great, big, strong nation that it is. 800 missionaries trace their origin to Hudson Taylor's initial foray into that continent. 125 schools of teaching. He is responsible for founding, either directly or indirectly, 300 preaching stations. 20,000 converts can be traced in some way to the ministerial evangelism of Hudson Taylor. But here's what a lot of people don't fully appreciate, or maybe they're not aware, that Hudson Taylor himself was converted by a simple gospel tract. That's right, just a simple gospel tract is what the Lord used in the pleasure of his own providence to convert Hudson Taylor to the faith. Now, what are we talking about when we describe open air evangelism? Well, of course, you can preach evangelistic sermons in church. You can preach the gospel and herald it as the free invitation to come to Christ, of course, on the Lord's Day and worship services, be it morning or evening, or any other time throughout the week, midday lectures, whatever you have. But open air evangelism is a special kind of evangelism in which Christians take the gospel, as it were, out onto the streets. And unfortunately, the passion, the drive, the fire, the heart for open air evangelism has largely been lost in our day. But that's not to suggest that open air evangelism doesn't have a very strong biblical priority. In fact, it does. When we look at the Holy Scriptures, one of the things that we're impressed with is that the majority of what we might call gospel preaching or evangelizing does take place in the context of open air evangelism. So again, open air evangelism would be defined as something as preaching the gospel, be it in the streets or the marketplace or the open corners, places where people gather, in fields, in barns, in hidden places. Of course, RPTS, the seminary, is a Covenanter seminary, meaning that we trace our denominational origins. Actually, I'm in the PCA, but you get the point. RPTS is denominationally affiliated with the RPCNA Church. To the Covenanters in Scotland, where, of course, much of that ministry during times of heavy persecution had to be done in places in open fields or hidden in forests or in the woods or in barns and things like that. And so this is certainly nothing that's strange to the Reformed and Presbyterian tradition in general. But again, looking at the scriptures, there's just a number of places where we could see what could no otherwise be described other than open air preaching. So Jeremiah preached in the gates or at the gates of the city. Ezra preached in the open square. We think of that wooden pulpit that was built for that occasion, but nevertheless an outdoor preaching occasion. John the Baptist obviously preached in the wilderness. Christ, some of his most famous sermons took place in the out of doors. His sermon on the plain, his Sermon on the Mount, of course, outside, evangelistic, to the masses, to the people. The disciples were instructed to go to the villages. The apostles preached at the temple. Of course, we might think of the temple as something like a church. Not exactly the same thing, but nevertheless, the temple square was one of the larger places where people could publicly gather for discussion, prayer, worship, conversation, etc. And Paul preaches one of the most famous open air or out of door sermons of all time, namely at Mars Hill or the Areopagus. So there's no doubt in my mind that there is strong biblical support for the concept of open air preaching. It's only a wonder then that it's hardly even done today very often at all, even amongst those churches which are Reformed in doctrine and Bible believing in terms of their orthodoxy, evangelistic or evangelical in terms of their ethos, and yet open air evangelism is largely neglected. I think that's to our detriment and to our fault. Now, there are a number of open air evangelists that we might think of, both Reformed and more generically evangelical. Of course, even in a seminary like RPTS, which has a strong Reformed Presbyterian leaning, that is the denominational heritage of the seminary, we can still nevertheless appreciate voices besides those that are RP or Presbyterian more generally, or Reformed even more broadly than that. We can learn things from other people outside of the tradition, and in fact there are a number of open air evangelists that we might think of as being largely successful by God's good graces. And so we might look to a man like George Whitefield, more about him in just a moment. Billy Graham could be considered an open air evangelist, so too Billy Sunday, who was his predecessor. David Brainerd, who we were going to discuss in another lecture. In fact, I did discuss that in yesterday's lectures. You know, I'll tell you what. Now that I think of it, that might be another really good free lecture to give away for anybody who's interested. I think I'll record that one next. I have a whole lecture on David Brainerd as a model evangelist. This course I'm building around not only theory in terms of understanding what evangelism is, but a lot about practical practice, but we're also incorporating historical anecdotes throughout as well. So I think I'll do another free lecture video on David Brainerd for you, just so you can get another sample of what taking a course at RPTS might be like. D.L. Moody, and then Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon, I don't know if you know this, he actually has a book called Lectures to My Students, where he delivered meaningful lectures to what was in his day something like a Bible college or a training seminary for pastors under his tutelage. In his book, Lectures to My Students, he actually has 2 articles on open air evangelism, and I'm going to quote substantially from one of those articles here in just a moment if you'll hang with me. But let's entertain a quote from Charles Spurgeon right now as we think about this concept. Spurgeon says, "Now it can be argued with small fear of refutation that open air preaching is as old as preaching itself. We are at full liberty to believe that Enoch, the 7th from Adam, when he prophesied, asked for no better pulpit than the hillside, and that Noah, as a preacher of righteousness, was willing to reason with his contemporaries in the shipyard wherein his marvelous ark was builded." Again, that's Spurgeon from Lectures to My Students. Now, probably within the Reformed tradition, and let me move my mug out of the way here so you can see this picture a little bit more here. George Whitefield might be considered one of the most significant open-air evangelists in the time of the Great Awakening. Now, when we think of the Great Awakening, we're talking here in the colonies, primarily the area between, well, dating it to 1740 to 1742. There were some things that happened prior to that, namely the localized Northampton revival. There are certainly things that have to happen after that. But 1740 to 1742 would be the times in which George Whitefield did his tremendous preaching throughout the colonies. And although not an RP or even a Presbyterian himself, Whitfield's doctrine was certainly Calvinistic. There's really no question about that. He was what we might call a Reformed preacher of the Anglican tradition, interestingly enough. He was ordained as an Anglican, but because of the flamboyance of his style, the demonstrative way in which Whitfield preached, he is sometimes called the divine dramatist, meaning that he preached his sermon somewhat extemporaneously, but certainly very dynamically, with a lot of stomping around, even acting out characters at some points, waving his arms in ways that were quite unusual for those men who were more staid in their presentation style, holding on to the edge of the pulpit as though for dear life. Whitfield often preached out of doors for the reason being that he was shut off from the churches. He was sometimes not welcome, sometimes disinvited from particular congregations. He was unwelcome to preach in certain congregations within the Anglican communion itself. And so when he comes to the Americas, Whitfield is largely responsible for organizing what we might call the sort of camp meetings or the revival meetings that are hallmarks of the First Great Awakening. Now, in the Second Great Awakening later on, you're going to see some stranger things that depart from Reformed orthodoxy, especially as it relates to a theology of conversion, some of Charles Finney's new contrived means in order to try to how should I say it, convince people to convert, or even to convert people by way of suggestion. Those things were not present in the First Great Awakening, so we're thankful for that. The First Great Awakening really is what I would consider to be a true revival of the Holy Spirit. Interestingly, though, one of the things that Whitfield does is in setting up these large evangelistic camp meetings, he preaches sometimes to hundreds, sometimes to thousands, and I know it's hard to believe it, but even 10,000 or more. Ben Franklin was one who could not believe that himself, that a man's voice could carry that far, so he actually went and tested it himself, and he was astonished to hear that the reports were true. Whitfield was probably one of the most famous people on planet Earth, believe it or not, at that time, largely because the flocks and crowds and throngs of people would come to hear him preach, and many people were, of course, converted under the preaching ministry of George Whitfield. But again, what's interesting about him is that he preached to the poor, he preached to the peasants, he preached to the farmers, he preached to the coal miners, even as churches were refusing to grant him entrance. And of course, no church is obligated to take a guest preacher, of course, no question about that. But basically, Whitfield took the pulpit from inside the church, put it outside the church, and people would gather by, again, the hundreds and the thousands to come to hear him preach. And so we might think of Whitfield as sort of a predecessor or even the founder of what we might call the modern day evangelistic meeting, or the camp meeting, or the revival style meeting. Now, I mentioned that Hudson Taylor was converted by a tract earlier on, and the reason that I brought that up by way of reference here is that he's not the only significant person to be converted under the means of an open-air evangelistic campaign. So here we have fellow Akronite. I was born in Akron as well. A.W. Tozer, move my face over here again. Tozer himself, interestingly, was converted by a soapbox-style outside preacher. Tozer was at that time working for one of the Akron's great rubber companies. I'm not exactly sure if it was Goodyear, Firestone, Bridgestone at that time, but he comes out of work from one of Akron's rubber factories, and he hears a soapbox preacher, and the preacher says, "Young man, if you don't know how to be saved, call on God, saying, 'Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner.'" And Tozer went home and by God's grace was converted to Christ. And so Tozer is another person to whom we can attribute God's glorious work in salvation as being a product of open-air evangelism. You know, one of the things in this particular class that I'm teaching, and one of the reasons why I wanted to give you a sample of this as an example kind of lecture here at RPTS, is there are so many things, practically speaking, that your church could do to carry out the work of open-air evangelism today. In fact, if you were to hear this lecture or take my class and be pushed to do one of these things in your church, I would be greatly honored that you considered even one of these suggestions. So, of course, you can go and do the same thing. You can go stand on a soapbox and preach the gospel in downtown Pittsburgh or Akron or Cleveland or anywhere else for good measure. Wherever you want to go, set up a little soapbox, stand on it, and start preaching the gospel. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, I commend you to try it. Tract distribution is a marvelous way to distribute information related to the gospel, door-to-door knocking. Now, let me just pause here and give you an anecdote. I'm the pastor here at Gospel Fellowship PCA, and one of the things that we've done as kind of a church strategy in terms of our evangelism is we actually marked out all of the neighborhoods. We took a map, and we have new developments cropping up all around. We have about 100 homes that are being built just within a mile of this church, but we have dozens and hundreds of other homes that are already in our near proximity and neighborhood. And so we printed out some Google Maps. I took a highlighter, and as we went door to door for as many houses as possible, we marked them off, and we tried to do a campaign of door-to-door invitation and evangelism. Now, was it largely successful? No, probably not. But one thing we did do is we let all of our neighbors know that we exist, and that if they needed anything, they had a pastor nearby and a church that they could come to. And I think that's something that practically every church could reasonably do, unless you happen to be a very rural setting church in which there are no neighborhoods around you. But even still, you could pick some of the neighborhoods that are closer to you, even if they would be a few miles of a drive, and go to those houses door to door, knock on them, give them some information. I gave out bulletins and newsletters and some of the things that we have in our narthex, just to let people know the kind of flavor that we are here as a church, Gospel Fellowship PCA. Food and meal distribution I consider to be open-air evangelism as well. There was a time recently where we took meals regularly to the trailer park that's not too terribly far from our church. That food ministry ended up kind of morphing over the months into another kind of ministry where we bring food to a downtown low-income residence building, and there we established a Bible study with the residents there. Really successful because they really wanted us to come. They missed church fellowship. A lot of them were disabled and unable to get to regular worship services, and so we brought it to them, and I consider that a form of open-air evangelism as well. On Election Day, another thing that we do at Gospel Fellowship is we hand out pro-life tracts and information. We distribute literature about our church. Again, we're just hoping to find people that may believe in the cause of life or the cause of abortion abolition or the pro-life movement, whatever you want to call it, and be interested in a church like ours. I even consider picketing, protesting, and going on marches as a form of open-air evangelism as well, and I do encourage your churches to do that. Here at Gospel Fellowship, there are 2 marches every year that we participate in: the National March for Life in Washington, D.C. in January, and then a statewide or Commonwealth-wide march that is in the Capitol here in Harrisburg. So all of these are various forms or methodologies of open-air evangelism. I'm not suggesting that your local church does all of them, but I am suggesting that your local church does some of them or specialize in one of them. You never know. You may, by God's grace, be used to lead somebody to the Lord like A.W. Tozer, who again was converted just by a simple street evangelist heralding and proclaiming the gospel from the street corners of Akron. Now, I want to mention a couple of advantages of open-air evangelism that perhaps you haven't thought of. The point is not always that you're going to convert dozens or hundreds of people. In fact, that doesn't seem to be the case that it happens that way. But first of all, it is a public witness to the gospel of Christ, and in as much as that has intrinsic value, I think it's worth the doing, even if nobody responds to the gospel. There's a number of courses of missionary studies of personal, individual missionaries, I should say, who were on the mission field for years, even decades, with very little results in terms of converts. But sometimes those converts are hidden, or sometimes they're next generation converts. Sometimes it's the sowing of the seed so that the gospel can be reaped later on in subsequent generations. So there is a real value to public witness, even if the results are not immediately known. For now, at least in this nation, it is legal, it is free, and it is very cheap. If you're worried about church budget costs, there's not a lot of cost at all to knocking on doors or proclaiming the gospel or even distributing tracts. They're extremely cheap, and copies can be run off by the thousands on your just regular old church copier. It doesn't even need to be fancy. I've found that it increases the boldness of the witness, him or herself. And so therein is another one of the benefits to open-air evangelism, is that you find yourself being emboldened for the sake of the gospel. And not only that, not only will you be emboldened as the one who's preaching the gospel, but other Christians who happen to hear you will likewise be emboldened in the faith. Open air evangelism does touch the hearts of certain kinds of people. Now, again, there's going to be some disadvantages, which I'm going to show you here in just a minute, but there are certain kinds of people out there, like we don't know what people are struggling with in their personal lives. A lot of people, I'm telling you, they're walking around with guilt and shame and fears and anxieties and loneliness and despair and worry and depression, and you might just hit that exact person that has a need, an existential crisis in their heart for the very thing that you're offering them, which is the hope of the gospel of Christ. And honestly, if we really believe that the gospel is true, we know for a fact that we have the answer to every existential crisis that people are experiencing in the heart. So if you go and you preach the gospel in whatever one of those mechanisms that I named, you may very well find that some people do, in fact, by God's grace, respond to the gospel message. I guarantee you, you will have contact with the unchurched. If your church needs to find more people that are unbelievers, if your only church growth is coming from transfer growth, that's probably not the best dynamic that you want to stay in as far as church growth goes. You want to be leading unbelievers to Christ. And if you want to contact unbelievers, then open air evangelism is probably the best way to do it. In terms of significance of numbers, okay, in terms of sheer volume, now again, I'm not saying that's going to be a high percentage yield, but in terms of sheer numbers, open air evangelism is probably the best way that you can proclaim the gospel to, again, hundreds or even thousands of people at a time. Now, there are some disadvantages to open-air evangelism, and we should at least be honest about those. First of all, it does tend to be somewhat confrontational if you don't have the, what's a good word to say here, the moxie for kind of this confrontational preaching type ministry. Then maybe this isn't suited for you personally, but I'm pretty sure that there's somebody in your congregation who does have the moxie to do it. So maybe it's not you, but it's somebody else. It can be somewhat impersonal in that if you're handing out tracts, maybe there's not a lot of relational follow-up. There is some risk too of physical danger. And of course, any kind of evangelism has to be supplemented by the local church. What is the point? Other than to lead people to Jesus, yes, but we also want to ingratiate them into membership and fellowship with the local church as well. Now, that's not necessarily a disadvantage per se, other than it's just an additional step that's required in terms of open air evangelism. Sometimes you're going to find that you will irritate local business owners. I have had that happen to me a couple of times before, where maybe you're in a market district, or maybe you're in a public place where somebody's trying to run a business or just trying to have a barber shop or something like that, and you're annoying to them. If you find that you're being annoying to local business owners, please don't be obnoxious. Just let them do what they're trying to do, make an honest living. We certainly don't want to disrupt people's welfare, their way of supporting themselves, their income, etc. We definitely don't want to do that. Now, I did mention earlier this book right here, Charles Spurgeon Lectures to My Students. He does have 2 articles on open air evangelism, which I would commend you to. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to read you a couple of quotations from that book, and then I'm going to switch over and tell you a little bit more about RPTS if you're interested in attending the seminary, okay? So Spurgeon says this, and let's quote here at length for a couple of paragraphs here. Spurgeon says, "Our Lord himself, who is yet more our pattern, delivered the larger portion of his sermons on the mountainside or by the seashore or in the streets. Our Lord was, to all intents and purposes, an open-air preacher. He did not remain silent in the synagogue, but he was equally at home in the field. We have no discourse of his record delivered in the chapel royal." In other words, we don't have any of his in-synagogue sermons necessarily, or like a chapel, like a church type setting. I guess he did preach that one time in the synagogue, right? But we have the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, so that the very earliest and most divine kind of preaching was practiced out of doors by him who spake as never man spoke. Okay, here's another one from Spurgeon. "It would be very easy to prove that revivals of religion have usually been accompanied, if not caused, by a considerable amount of preaching out of doors or in unusual places. The first avowed preaching of Protestant doctrine was almost necessarily in the open air or in buildings which were not dedicated to worship, for these were in the hands of the papacy," he says. Sermons and prayer meetings, addresses and hymns might follow each other in wise succession. Perhaps thousands might be induced to gather to worship God, among whom would be scores and hundreds who never enter our regular sanctuaries. Not only must something be done to evangelize the millions, but everything must be done, and perhaps amid the variety of effort, the best thing would be discovered. So here's what Spurgeon's saying there. Like, there's a lot of work to be done. The nations need to be evangelized, the peoples, the tribes. The gospel task of the Great Commission, fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant, is so monumentally large that we just have to do all kinds of things to proclaim the gospel. And Spurgeon says, hey, get out there, try something. You might find yourself to be more successful than you thought. No defense is needed for preaching out of doors, but it would need be very potent arguments to prove that a man had done his duty who has never preached beyond the walls of his meeting house. In other words, if you're only preaching the gospel in the church, the burden of proof is on you to show that you've done enough. In other words, we see so much open-air evangelism in the scriptures that a gospel minister would be hard-pressed to prove that he's thoroughly doing the work of an evangelist or a preacher if he's not doing some out-of-door preaching. Finally, we ought always to go into the streets and lanes and highways, for there are lurkers in the hedges, tramps on the highway, street walkers and lane haunters, whom we shall never reach unless we pursue them in their own domains. Spurgeon is absolutely right here. No question about that. So go get them, preachers. He says, I am persuaded that the more open-air preaching there is in London, the better. If it should become a nuisance to some, it will be a blessing to others. If properly conducted, if it will be the gospel which is spoken, and if the spirit of the preacher be one of love and truth, the results cannot be doubted. Again, I just commend you to those particular lectures. Now, real quick, let me tell you a little bit more about RPTS. So again, this was just a sample, just a clip. It wasn't even a full lecture, just a sample of what you might get if you went to RPTS. I will try to post in subsequent videos here other examples of pieces from lectures. One of the reasons I posted this particular piece is because I'm afraid that sometimes the stereotype of the seminary is that the level of learning is so far beyond the average Christian that they think that they have to be some sort of intellectual genius to go to seminary. Of course, that's not true. Now, there are some very hard things that we cover at seminary, including the languages of the biblical languages of Greek and Hebrew. Those things would be required if you're going to pursue an MDiv, the Master of Divinity, which is the standard degree for ordained ministers, especially within the Reformed tradition, including denominations like the RPCNA, which is the denomination of RPTS, or the PCA, my denomination. Again, we are in fellowship together, though in different denominations. But we also have degrees like the MTS, the Master of Theological Studies, which even if you're not going to be a pastor necessarily, that might be a degree worth pursuing if you want to teach in a Christian school, or if you want to be an evangelist of a different kind, perhaps not an ordained evangelist or an ordained Presbyterian minister. Maybe for other denominations outside the Reformed tradition, the MTS might be enough in terms of ordination if you're Baptist or non-denominational, and the academic standards there are different from what we have in Reformed and Presbyterian churches. The MTS might be a good degree for you. And if you're thinking that seminary is far too expensive for you to ever attend, I just want to challenge you on that notion. Give us a call at RPTS. Maybe what you're going to find is that it's more affordable than you thought. In fact, there are ways to do it. We have the one-third, one-third, one-third program where the student only pays a third of their seminary. If their church can support them in the second third, then the seminary will help with the other third. We have all kinds of programs like that. And not only that, but our online programs are outstanding. You can do much of your MDiv online. You can do most, if not all, of your MTS completely online. So if you want to do distance education, we have ways to do that. Basically, the reason that I love RPTS is it, again, is the oldest conservative seminary. I love the tradition. I love the RP Church. Even though I'm in the PCA, we are brothers in Christ, so we love and support each other there. I'm glad to be part of it, and I would love to have you as a student myself. So if you ever want to take a class from me, let's see if we can't make that happen. All right. Well, give us a call. Call up RPTS. Talk to a guy called Brian, or ask for Dr. York. He's the president of the institution. I'm sure he'd be glad to talk to you as a prospective student. Maybe you and I can be in class one day, and I will try to post another clip of a lecture at some point in the future. For today, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for checking into this particular channel. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.